They called themselves the House of Israel. But they had never heard of Hanukkah. Not once, not ever. For centuries they followed the Torah, worshipped in sacred silence, climbed mountains to renew their covenant with God. But no menorahs, no Maccabees, no memory of the miracle that every other Jewish community had passed down for generations. How is that possible? This community lived in the Ethiopian highlands, far from Jerusalem, farther still from the modern Jewish world. They kept Sabbath without fire, observed purity laws that even Orthodox Jews forgot, and when outsiders finally reached them in the 20th century, they found no rabbis, no Talmud, no Hebrew schools, just one claim, repeated by every elder with quiet certainty. We are descendants of the tribe of Dan, a tribe that, according to the Bible, vanished after the Assyrian exile, a tribe most scholars had written off as a myth. But here, in the misty mountains of Gondar and Tigray, Fo was a living people, who never forgot who they were, or maybe they never knew what the world forgot. Because while their brothers and sisters were scattered across Europe, Asia and the Middle East, the Beta Israel disappeared into legend, ignored by rabbis, dismissed by historians, and hidden in plain sight for over 2,000 years. That silence might have lasted forever, if not for the tools of a very different priesthood. Geneticists who weren't looking for prophecy or politics, just patterns. They swabbed cheeks, ran code, and when they mapped the genomes of Beta Israel, what they found sent shockwaves through history. Because the bloodline didn't lie. It told a story no one was ready to hear. A story that didn't begin in Africa, but didn't quite end in Israel either. And in that blood was a fracture, a split, a whisper of something ancient and something completely unexpected. Because if their prayers were from Sinai, their DNA came from somewhere else entirely. And that's where we go next, into the bloodlines that science said shouldn't exist. Their prayers reached Jerusalem, but their blood whispered something far older, far deeper, something rooted in Africa's bones. When scientists cracked open the Y chromosomes of Beta Israel men, the results didn't line up with any Jewish community known to modern genetics. Over 70% belonged to haplogroups A and E, lineages that stretch back tens of thousands of years to the very heart of East Africa. These weren't signatures from ancient Canaan, not from Judea, not from Babylon or the Levant. These were African, pure and undeniable. Lineages older than writing, older than temples. Lineages found in the mountains of Ethiopia, in the Nilotic valleys, in tribes that never knew Moses or Abraham, at least not according to science. And so the question fell like a blade. Were the Beta Israel ever Jewish to begin with? Or had they preserved something even older than rabbinic, Judaism itself? Something from before the exile, before the Talmud, before even Hanukkah lit its first candle? The contradiction was brutal. These were people who lived by the Torah, who followed Leviticus like it was life and death. But their blood, at least the male line, said they weren't from the same stock as the rest of the Jewish world. Still, the researchers found something strange, quiet, almost hidden. A thread buried in the data? A few men carried haplogroup J1. Now, J1 isn't African, it's Middle Eastern, it's ancient Semitic, it's found among Arabs, yes, but also among Jews. And most curiously, it's often linked to the Kohanim, the priestly caste said to descend from Aaron, brother of Moses. This wasn't a flood of evidence, it was a whisper, but a powerful one, because if these lineages made it into the Beta Israel, they had come a long way, crossing borders, deserts, perhaps centuries, It wasn't enough to silence the skeptics, but it was enough to raise a bigger, harder question. If the fathers of Beta Israel came from Africa, where did the mothers come from? The answer changes everything. If the fathers came from Africa, the mothers were caught between two worlds. When scientists turned their focus to mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, they expected more of the same, deep African roots, ancient and local. What they found instead split the story in half. Roughly 50% of Beta Israel women carried African haplogroups, no surprise there. But the other half? They carried lineages traced not to Ethiopia, but to the ancient Levant, to the Arabian Peninsula, to lands whispered about in Torah scrolls and temple songs. This wasn't just one anomaly, these were solid, repeated signals, R0, HV, M1, markers from West Eurasia, shared by Middle Eastern, North African, and even Southern European populations. These maternal haplogroups weren't recent imports. They were old, older than many modern ethnic identities. And their presence here, in the highlands of Ethiopia, suggested something startling. That long ago, perhaps 2,000, even 3,000 years back, women from the Middle East arrived in East Africa. Not as tourists, not as colonists, but as part of something bigger. Maybe they were daughters of Israel, maybe converts, maybe survivors of war, or trade, or exile. The Red Sea wasn't a wall, it was a bridge. Ancient traders, priests, refugees and migrants crossed from Yemen to the Horn of Africa, from Egypt to Kush, long before modern borders existed. The trade routes were bustling, so were the escape routes, and somewhere along those sunburnt paths, a handful of women carried not just spices or cloth, but bloodlines that would root in Ethiopia, merge with local communities and survive in silence for millennia. So now we had a contradiction, fathers from Africa, mothers with Middle Eastern echoes, and a people claiming to be descended from a tribe that history said was lost, which begs the question, who was the first to say it? Who stood up, in exile or in memory, and said, "We are the tribe of Dan"? And more importantly, why? Long before DNA, long before maps could prove ancestry or science could trace bloodlines, there was a voice, a whisper really. In the 9th century, a man appeared in the markets of the Islamic world, claiming something unbelievable. His name was Eldad Hardani, and he said he came from a lost Jewish kingdom in Africa. Not a theory, not a dream, a kingdom. He spoke fluent ancient Hebrew, but it was strange, stiff, archaic, like it had frozen in time. He followed the Torah to the letter, but his laws didn't match the Talmud. He had no knowledge of rabbinic debates, no Mishnah, no halakhic commentaries. When rabbis questioned him, Eldad held fast. He described tribes of Israel still living beyond the rivers of Kush, past deserts and Nile tributaries, governed by elders, protected by divine law. In Europe they laughed, in Babylon they doubted. But in Africa, someone was listening. Because centuries later, in the mountains of Ethiopia, when missionaries and scholars met the Beta Israel, they heard something familiar. A language that echoed Eldad's Hebrew, a law that mirrored his Torah. And when they asked the elders where they came from, many said, "We are Danites." We are the people Eldad described. They believed him, not because they read his scrolls, but because they lived his reality. Eldad's words had faded in Europe's libraries. His name barely survived as a curiosity, but in Ethiopia his story became identity. Still, one mystery remained. How did a man who described a hidden Jewish kingdom so precisely, so accurately, disappear from the pages of Jewish memory? Why did the world forget him, just as it forgot the people he claimed to descend from? The answer isn't in what he said, it's in what the Beta Israel did. Because long before science traced their DNA, long before Israel accepted them as Jews, they were living something extraordinary. And the proof wasn't in Eldad's mouth, it was in their hands, their voices, their rituals, the ones no other Jews on earth remembered, but they never forgot. Once a year they climb the mountain, not for a festival, not for a feast, but for a covenant. It's called cited, a day unlike anything in the Jewish calendar, because no one else celebrates it. The Beta Israel gather in silence. They fast, they chant, they carry the Torah to the highest peaks they can reach, just like their ancestors did. And then, in full view of the sky, they read aloud the laws of Moses and renew their bond with God. It's not a reenactment, it's a return. A ritual that mirrors what Ezra and Nehemiah led over 2,500 years ago, when the Israelites came back from Babylonian exile. But here's the mystery. How did the Beta Israel remember that moment when every other Jewish community forgot? They had no Talmud, no rabbinic leadership, no letters from Jerusalem, no connection to Babylon, Spain or Poland. They were cut off, yet carried a practice that predates nearly everything we call Judaism today. Where others evolved, they remained still. Where others adapted, they preserved. Their version of the covenant isn't filtered through centuries of exile or reinterpretation. It feels raw, original, almost untouched, and it leaves a haunting question hanging in the air. What else have we forgotten that only they remembered? Because the rituals of Sig don't fit into modern Jewish life. They don't celebrate the Maccabees, they don't light candles for miracles, they don't even mention Hanukkah. Why? Because by the time the Maccabees lit their lamps, the Beta Israel were already gone. Their Judaism didn't evolve in synagogues or academies. It was frozen, sealed like an artifact, preserved not in glass, but in living bodies. And if that's true, if Sigd is a window into Second Temple faith, then what else do they remember that the world has lost? One answer lies in their customs, the laws they followed not because they were taught, but because they never stopped. They lit no fire on the Sabbath. They built huts for menstruating women. They purified, isolated, waited, as if the temple still stood. At first, Israeli authorities were confused, then disturbed, because when the Beta Israel finally returned to Israel, their Judaism looked nothing like what rabbis were used to. There were no Siddurim, no Talmudic quotes, no trace of rabbinic rulings, just the Torah, and laws that felt severe, ancient, almost alien. Some rabbis said it wasn't Judaism at all. But then something unexpected happened. As archaeologists dug into the caves of Qumran, uncovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found communities from 2,000 years ago, sectarian Jews living apart, awaiting the Messiah, obsessed with purity. And their laws? They looked familiar. No fire on Sabbath. Strict separation of men and women. Menstruation huts. Ritual immersion. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was a mirror. The Beta Israel weren't outliers. They were time capsules. They had preserved almost word for word the kind of Judaism practiced by groups like the Essenes, the very sects who lived before the temple fell. And now the twist, the very customs that led some to question their Jewishness, might be the most ancient Jewish traditions still alive anywhere on earth. No edits, no reinterpretations. Just practice, carried forward, unchanged, as the rest of the Jewish world spun through empires, ghettos, enlightenment. It's as if their world paused while ours moved on. But this raises a deeper mystery. Because preserving a few customs for a generation or two is one thing, but to carry them unchanged for 2,000 years, through war, famine, persecution, exile, without books, without rabbis, without contact, that defies logic, and yet they did it. The question isn't whether Beta Israel were Jewish. The question is, how did they survive as Jews when the rest of the world forgot they existed? They had waited for centuries, prayed toward Jerusalem, held on to the Torah like a lifeline in the dark, and then the planes came. In the 1980s and 1990s, Israeli missions named Operation Moses and Operation Solomon flew thousands of Beta Israel from Ethiopia to Israel. Families packed into cargo holds, babies born mid-flight, no luggage, no warning, just faith. They thought they were going home, but when they arrived, nothing looked familiar. The synagogues were strange, the prayers were foreign, the holidays, Hanukkah, Purim, Rosh Hashanah. They had never heard of them. They didn't know the Hebrew songs. They didn't recognize the rituals. They had never seen a yarmulke. They brought scrolls older than most had ever seen, but were met with silence. Because while Israel had opened its skies, it hadn't fully opened its heart. Many rabbis questioned their authenticity. They were asked to undergo symbolic conversions. A quiet suggestion that maybe, just maybe, they weren't really Jews. Imagine fasting your whole life, carrying a Torah up a mountain every year, waiting to return to Zion, only to be told you don't quite belong. Some cried, some rebelled, some simply faded into the silence of absorption. Archival footage captures their faces, tired, stunned, overwhelmed, kneeling to kiss a land that they had only known in dreams. It wasn't a reunion, it was a reckoning, a spiritual return, met with an identity test. But even as the nation debated their legitimacy, even as politics tangled with prophecy, scientists were quietly working behind the scenes, running samples, mapping chromosomes, looking for answers not in theology, but in genetic code. Because while Israel wrestled with their faith, the DNA was beginning to speak. Their prayers echoed Sinai. But their genes echoed the mountains of Ethiopia. When scientists ran full genome analyses on the Beta Israel, the results seemed clear at first glance. They clustered genetically, not with Jews from Europe or the Middle East, but with their neighbours, the Amhara, the Tigray, indigenous highland Ethiopians. They looked African, lived African, spoke Amharic, but practiced an ancient version of Judaism older than almost anything seen in synagogues today. So what were they? Not converts, not imposters, but something far more complex and far more powerful. The data told a story hidden in the blood of a small group of Israelite migrants who arrived, perhaps fleeing conquest, exile, or collapse nearly 2,000 years ago. They mixed with local Ethiopian communities. They intermarried. They disappeared into the land, but they didn't lose their faith. Through generations, they passed it down, without writing, without schools, without teachers. Not out of rebellion, but out of memory. This is what geneticists call a founder effect. When a tiny group seeds a new population, over time, their specific genes may fade into the background, but their customs, if rooted deep enough, can survive. And that's what happened here. The Beta Israel aren't Ethiopians who adopted Judaism. They are what happens when an exiled people fuses with a new world, but keeps one hand clutched tightly to the Torah. Their rituals, unshaped by rabbis, untouched by diaspora law, may be the closest living link to Judaism, as it was practiced before the Talmud, before the synagogues, before the scattering, and in that fusion there's something beautiful, something ancient, something that says identity isn't always found in pure blood, but in the refusal to forget. Still, one question haunted the researchers. If a Jewish group really arrived here 2,000 years ago, how did they get there? What road did they take? Because the next clue wasn't in Ethiopia. It was buried in the sands of a forgotten kingdom just north of the border. The answers weren't buried in Ethiopia's soil. They were floating just north, along the Nile. For decades, the search for Beta Israel's origin focused on the mountains. But a new theory shifted the spotlight, not east, not south, but north, to Nubia, to the ancient kingdom we now call Sudan. Historians had long whispered about it, but now archaeologists and geneticists were connecting dots across centuries. In the 5th century BCE, Jewish military colonies lived at Elephantine, an island fortress on the Nile under Persian rule. They built temples, they worshipped Yahweh, they followed Torah law, but with strange pre-rabbinic twists. Sound familiar? Now trace the Nile south, past the deserts, past the cataracts, into the heart of Kush. What if the Jews of Elephantine didn't vanish, but kept moving? What if, when their temples were destroyed and their communities scattered, some travelled further upstream? The Beta Israel's ancestral lands, Gondar, Wogarah, are actually closer to Sudan than they are to the traditional Jewish trade ports of Yemen or Egypt. And here's the twist. Some patterns in their DNA, certain African Jewish admixtures, fit better with Nile corridor migration than with Ethiopian conversion. It paints a haunting picture of Israelites cast out from Jerusalem, forming colonies in Elephantine, then pushed again downstream until they climbed into the highlands and took root. They didn't arrive as an army, they came in whispers. Families, merchants, refugees, priests without a temple. And what they carried wasn't just blood, it was ritual, law, memory. It was the Torah, wrapped in silence and time. So maybe the mystery of Beta Israel doesn't begin in Ethiopia at all. Maybe their origin lies further back, along the river, through kingdoms erased from maps, through temples swallowed by sand. And if that's true, then one chilling question rises. If a tribe could survive that journey, through exile, through silence, through millennia, what other tribes might have done the same? They never studied the Talmud, they never spoke Yiddish, they never lit a menorah, and yet they carried the Torah, not just in scrolls, but in memory, in ritual, in silence. For years, Beta Israel's identity was debated in courtrooms and synagogues. Geneticists showed divergence. Politicians hesitated. Some rabbis doubted. But eventually, something deeper prevailed. Israel's chief rabbinate ruled, yes, they are Jews, not because their DNA matched perfectly, but because their practice, their resilience, their covenant never broke. They had lived like Israelites for 2,000 years without a rabbi, without a Mishnah, without a homeland. And that, finally, was enough. Sigd, the mountaintop covenant they preserved alone for centuries, is now a national holiday. Their priests, the Kessim, once dismissed as relics of a forgotten faith, now lead public prayers in Jerusalem. And Beta Israel, the tribe science once questioned, now walks the streets of Zion, holding the Torah, not as guests, but as family. It's an emotional return, not just to a place, but to a people. Because Jewishness, after exile, war and diaspora, is no longer just a bloodline. It's a memory, a ritual, a refusal to disappear. And Beta Israel proved that you can carry the soul of a people across continents, even if your DNA took a detour. But their return wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a bigger question. Because if this lost tribe, cut off for millennia, still found their way home, then who else is still out there, waiting, hiding, remembering? If Beta Israel were real, if a lost tribe survived in silence for 2,000 years, then what else have we missed? Because their story, once dismissed as myth, is now proven by science, ritual and return. So what about the others? What about the B'nai Menashe in the hills of India, who light Sabbath candles, chant in ancient tones, and trace their ancestry back to Manasseh, son of Joseph? What about the Igbo of Nigeria, whose elders speak of Abraham, who circumcise on the 8th day, who bury their dead facing east? What about the Lemba of Zimbabwe and South Africa, who carry oral traditions of the Ark of the Covenant, practice kosher-like dietary laws, and have priestly lineages with Semitic DNA? These aren't fantasy. These are real communities, with scrolls, with songs, with stories handed down in secret, in exile, in isolation. And now, for the first time, geneticists are listening. They're swabbing cheeks in mountain villages, sequencing genomes in forgotten towns, comparing ancient rituals with modern code. And what they're finding challenges everything we thought we knew about Jewish history. Because the map was never finished, the exile was never clean, and the tribes never disappeared. They scattered into jungles, into deserts, into places we never thought to look. So this isn't the end of the story. This isn't a closing chapter. This is the first line of a long-lost book, a book whose pages are just starting to be uncovered. And somewhere out there, maybe in the hills of Myanmar, or the valleys of Papua New Guinea, or the forests of Central Africa, a tribe is still waiting, still praying, still remembering, because the next tribe is out there, and it's only a matter of time before they are found.